Hi, everyone, and welcome to this video lecture on training delivery. In this unit, we'll talk about training methods and different ways of training people both on the job and through other formal and informal approaches. So we'll start by talking about lecture and discussion methods, which are the most widely used formal method of education and training delivery. Obviously, a lot of you have been exposed to a lot of lecture and discussion-based education. And one of the main reasons for that is because it's both inexpensive and relatively efficient. A lot of information can be covered at a time. The audience can be small or large. And so it's a cheap way and a very efficient way to cover information for different sizes of groups. There's definitely a widely held belief that the method is ineffective because the trainee is a passive recipient of what is usually one-way communication with little or no feedback. Empirical research does not necessarily support this idea. In fact, there's evidence that active lecturing, lecturers who are very engaging and who involve the audience in the lecture process, can actually produce substantial amounts of knowledge using this method. So there's definitely evidence that this works best for knowledge acquisition. So if we're talking about declarative knowledge rather than procedural knowledge, but also to some extent for attitudinal change and other types of variables as well. This is not an effective method for complex response development. If we're trying to get someone to develop a procedural skill, we definitely don't want to use mostly a lecture and discussion method. That would be very problematic. And regardless of what we're using lecture and discussion methods for, they usually work best when they're blended with some other techniques or activities that enhance and get away from this mostly passive nature of this method. The next slide covers on-the-job training, which is probably the most widely used informal method of training. So when we talked in class about the various 70-20-10 models, a lot of people use the 70% in that model to represent on-the-job learning. This is very common and generally relatively informal, but it may be formal. So you could, for instance, have mentoring programs, coaching, internships, which are much more structured, or apprenticeships, which are structured types of internships for skilled trades that can all be subsumed under the OJT or on-the-job training heading. So those tend to be more formal rather than more informal, but they do count as on-the-job training. The advantages to on-the-job training are many. The trainee is often producing while they're learning. So when we talk about the costs of training and the downtime associated with training, on-the-job training helps alleviate that pain point by having people doing things while they're learning. On-the-job training also produces often ease of transfer of training because people are actually doing the job as they're learning. They're performing real job skills, so it's high fidelity. And then on-the-job training can be less expensive than other formal types of learning. The disadvantages is that you often have a diversion of trainer time. So whereas the trainee may be producing while they're learning, the trainer is often devoting time to extra supervision and maybe repeating remedial steps to the trainee. And so this is time that they could spend normally working that is now downtime for the training process. We often also see with on-the-job training a lack of preparation on the part of the trainee, and so they make errors. And those errors can be costly. So even though they're producing while learning, if they're producing incorrectly, this is problematic. And then finally, trainers in this sort of informal method, especially when it's really informal, often pass along bad habits, not necessarily the most effective approaches to getting training done, but instead sort of shortcuts, or because their attention is diverted because they're trying to do their job and the training, they may pass along less effective ways of getting things done. So ideally, on-the-job training should be structured and should use some kind of social learning framework where the trainer is modeling appropriate behavior and the trainee is following or modeling that behavior, imitating the behavior that they see the trainer doing. The next slide covers what's called self-directed learning, and this is just learning where employees are responsible for learning material. Usually this consists of some kind of modular training material. And many of you have done different kinds of courses or programs this way, where you dig into some learning content. It may be textual, it may be placed online, as we'll talk about in a bit, and so on. But you move through at your own pace, often through modules. And then maybe at the end of each module, you have to pass some kind of quiz or demonstrate some sort of proficiency. The advantages of self-directed learning approaches are that trainees can learn at their own pace. We use the term asynchronous to describe that. An asynchronous program is one where people can move at different paces. This is often a problem in training when you have trainees at different levels and you're presenting complex information. People get it, some people don't, or you're presenting easy information. Higher ability trainees are bored to death, and then lower ability trainees are learning what they need to. So a self-directed or asynchronous kind of approach can actually help with allowing people to move through at their own pace while you're building in a lot of feedback, so it can be very cost effective. The disadvantages are some people don't learn on their own. They need that communal approach to learning, either something that's directed by a facilitator or trainer, or they need to work with others in learning content. So they just don't do well at this self-directed kind of self-paced approach. One flavor or approach to self-directed learning that's common is something called programmed instruction, which is based on reinforcement theory. And basically, it's just like typical self-directed learning, but with more evaluation and assessment and feedback within each module, so that you're providing reinforcement to the trainee for what they've learned and then application of what they've learned, and so on. Most of the research on self-directed learning suggests that it's about equal in learning and retention to traditional training, but faster. And that's true in both academic and industrial settings. As you see at the very bottom of the slide, e-learning approaches are often self-directed in nature. So much of the online training that a lot of you have probably done is relatively asynchronous. People can go through at their own pace. There may be some max time set or some end dates for things, but you can move through mostly at a pace that works well for you. The next slide deals with an area that is definitely increasing in frequency, and that is simulation in the training environment. Simulation just describes a system that duplicates actions and responses of work behavior or the environment where the work behavior will occur. And when you think of simulation, you often think of very high-tech, complex things like virtual reality. And definitely we're using more and more VR in fields like medical education and other areas like that. But simulation also encompasses low-tech activities like role-playing and behavior modeling that are very commonly used in training. One aspect that we discussed earlier that's very important in simulation is the concept of fidelity, which was part of the theory of identical elements that we discussed in the first set of these notes. And so we talked about both physical and psychological fidelity. Physical fidelity is how much the training environment looks like the actual work environment, and psychological fidelity is how much it invokes the same cognitive processes as the actual work environment. Of the two, psychological fidelity is much more important, but there is some evidence that physical fidelity matters as well, because it produces this sort of state-dependent or context-dependent learning where when people see the physical markers that are part of the environment, it can induce some memory cueing and that sort of thing. But the most important thing is that training invokes the same cognitive processes, the psychological fidelity, so that what you're learning is more flexible and adaptable and not to a specific environment. Simulation is very useful in terms of assessing skill levels, giving people sort of risk-free ways to try new skills, illustrating the relationships between people and actions. So I've used driving simulators quite a bit, for instance, in working with professional drivers and trying to teach them new techniques where they don't have to be out on the road worrying about crashing. I used a lot of this with the Air Force training pilots. Obviously, you don't want to put them in $30 million planes and have them learn to fly, kind of on the job. Instead, you use simulators where they can try all sorts of complex maneuvers without risk. Another issue is that you can test decision making with simulation to see how people respond under different complex situations. So, one area that simulation is being used increasingly for is training police officers about making decisions for things like use of force or appropriate ways of arresting people or making contact with people and that sort of thing. So, you can test decision making in that context and have the officers not have to make errors that would obviously be problematic if we're dealing with real members of the public. And there's a lot of evidence that this kind of training can make a big difference in the effectiveness and public reaction to police work. The next slide covers the case study approach. Case studies you're very familiar with, having been trained in business education. They're very commonly used in business education and management development. The idea here is that recall and knowledge application is most likely when skills are learned through discovery. So if we give people these applied cases to work on, they can apply the skills they've learned and then have more generalizable or transferable knowledge. So case studies may deal with real cases that organizations have faced, or they may deal with hypothetical scenarios that are set up for people to solve. So again, you're very familiar with these. You know, the Carlson School has a case competition, and this is very common for people to do these as a sort of group work in the classroom environment, but also in managerial development, they're commonly used. We see a lot of criticism around the case study method for a lack of focus on general principles. One argument that I often make against using them, or at least the overuse of them, is a lot of times the information is so specific, how a given company dealt with a specific pressure point or change, that the way that would be best for that organization to respond, or the best solution in that context, may not be the best solution in another context. These may involve also detrimental group processes. So, as many of you know, group work has some potential advantages, but also has some potential disadvantages: group polarization, group think, social loafing, all of those kind of problems. One spin-off of case studies that's used in the real work environment is what's called action learning. And this is where you give people case-oriented project work on the job where they can apply skills that they've learned through training or that they need to learn for job performance. So very common, for instance, when we think about interns in organizations receiving project-based assignments, and that project will be based on some specific competence or area of focus that the intern needs to develop in. And so that project may be a low stakes thing that's a real application. It's not a historical or a hypothetical. Instead, it's a real application, but it's often something of low stakes to the organization, so they don't get burned by having an intern resolve it. Then we could talk about, the next slide deals with the concept of e-learning, which is very rapidly growing. We're definitely seeing more companies are using e-learning technologies, and some as their primary mode of training delivery. Obviously, in the college or university setting, you're being exposed to more e-learning courses, online courses, and that kind of thing. So the base definition of e-learning is just information and instruction that's delivered through some kind of computer network technology. It may be intranet, so within an organization's network system, or it may be internet-based, accessible via anywhere. So you can get this kind of stuff, obviously, on Khan Academy, on YouTube, et cetera, on the internet. But you also have corporate intranet systems where you can access training that people outside can't access. The potential advantages of e-learning are pretty significant. You can conduct training anywhere at remote sites. So I might have, when I do an e-learning program, a training that I'm facilitating for hundreds of people across different locations, and that's nice. Another potential advantage is the asynchronous issue that we talked about with self-directed learning. Training can be uploaded somewhere where different trainees can complete it at different paces. So sometimes I'll do a combination of both, where I'll conduct live training where people can access it live at remote sites, But then if they're not available to access it, they can get it through some archive and do it at their own pace when it fits into time that would otherwise be unproductive for them. Another advantage is the low trainer cost, right? So initially developing e-learning can be expensive, but once it's been developed, it's just an access issue. All you're paying for is bandwidth. Trainee travel costs are obviously non-existent. We can train people anywhere, anytime, theoretically. And another big advantage to e-learning is consistency in terms of quality or content of instruction over time and from group to group. So even when I teach face-to-face, I notice across different lectures in the same course or different courses, there may be days where I do a better job of covering some content. So if one group of trainees gets day one and another group of trainees get the same lecture another day, they may come out with different experiences because my behavior is not consistent. Whereas with e-learning, once we've uploaded the material and ensured that it contains everything we want, everyone is getting the same thing every time. So that consistency is a definite advantage. Some other advantages to e-learning would include that changes and updates can be distributed to all learners very quickly. So we can go in and make changes to systems and send things out to learners and tell them, we've updated this, take a look at that. E-learning is often self-paced, and so that gives us increased efficiency. Low ability learners can spend more time on the material, they can review it, go back multiple times. High ability learners can move through the material more quickly. So this is a very advantageous property of e-learning. Empirical data suggests that retention with e-learning is at least as good as with other methods and sometimes better. So I think it definitely is an area that has kind of a bad rep. People think e-learning is no good, but research does not support that. I would argue that in some of the classes, both training classes and academic classes I teach, that students in the online sections get a better experience because they get a richer, more interactive environment where there's usually smaller numbers of learners and more assignments and applications and that kind of thing, instead of a bunch of people jammed into a lecture hall getting more standardized content all at once. E-learning also is quite advantageous in being able to generate immediate feedback and evaluation information. So we can build into e-learning modules feedback as the trainee is progressing. They can see how they're doing at things. And then we can also build in evaluation. So generally when I design e-learning, I'll build in some sort of system for assessing trainee reactions, trainee learning, and so on into the content itself, or their ability to apply some of the content scenarios that they have to evaluate and this kind of thing. So from a data collection standpoint, e-learning is actually quite advantageous. There's a lot of ways to get data on what trainees are doing. I can look at how much time people are spending on slides, how often they're logging into the course, how often they're interacting with different pieces of media, and so on. So it's a very data-rich environment. Then the last slide deals with e-learning concerns, and these are definitely things to think about as well. The first is trying to figure out if there's a strategic rationale for using this format. So you remember last week or the week before we talked about this issue of if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think a lot of organizations have treated e-learning as this issue where they have the technology and by damn, they're going to use it, regardless of whether it makes sense for the content or context of training. So I've seen a lot of training placed online. I think just because organizations think they can do it, it'll be efficient, trainees can access it, et cetera. But for some kinds of training, it doesn't work very effectively. And especially when they haven't aligned the e-learning with some strategic rationale, support from managers, technological support, resources to support it, et cetera. So that's all very important, these next couple of questions. Are there adequate resources to support it, right? Do you have a help desk where people can interact if they're having technological problems? Do you have the money to do good instructional design to develop e-learning? Do you have the bandwidth to support it? So one thing that I see often is they'll develop some very media-rich e-learning, and then employees are expected to access it in places where their connection is pretty spotty. And what they get is training that's kind of cutting in and out, stopping and starting and whatnot. And that's very demotivating, obviously, to trainees. And then the last question is kind of a philosophical question, but something that's very important to me is, does e-learning infringe on employees' work-life balance? And so I think we'll talk about this a little bit in class, but it seems to me that a lot of companies are seeing e-learning as a way to push training time out of the traditional workday, and then employees are expected to get training done even though it's not being done in their typical work hours. And so what this basically does is increases the span of employee responsibility, and that obviously has a negative net effect on work-life balance. So I think rather than going into detail about that, I'll ask about that question in class and whether you've had examples of that. So that's it for now, and I will see you soon. The next unit will deal with training evaluation, so make sure that you've read the material on training evaluation, and I'll post lecture slides to accompany that material. Thanks, and we'll talk again soon.